As we discussed in the last module, we find Plato wanting to refute the doctrine of epistemic relativism. And he wants to do so in a way that also refutes the doctrine of skepticism. He wants to offer a tentative account of knowledge that's based upon an objective universal standard, which allows one to both succeed to know in an intersubjectively verifiable fashion, but also to fail to know. In formulating and investigating accounts of knowledge here, he's going to formulate and investigate models of the mind and its interaction with the world. And these two components operating in the background are going to be very important, though usually when people talk about the Theaetetus, they don't really emphasize these that much. In this dialogue, I want to claim, it seems that to understand knowledge, one has to understand the mind and how the mind interacts with the world. And so there are going to be two important components: our understanding of the perceptual world, or Plato's understanding of the perceptual world, and the way in which he tries to come up with a model for how the mind interacts with the world, a model that will allow him to have objective, universal knowledge, but also fail to have objective, universal knowledge. So let's take a look at that first element, the world. To do this, we have to realize that for Plato, at least, maybe for the Greeks generally, you can't believe your eyes, as it were. They seem to have had a view about perception that is much different from our normal notion of perception. So vision is a nice example of this. And so to sort of emphasize this, we'll use Rod Sterling from the Twilight Zone to illustrate the way that Plato and other Greeks seem to think about perceptual experience. So it's a world in which things aren't necessarily as they seem. So the Greeks will often talk about all sorts of different perceptual illusions. Plato will make mention to perceptual illusions of sensations of heat and cold, of relative object size and distance, and so on. And so there's this view of the world that we see reflected in his discussion about the relativists and how they hold the doctrine of eternal flux. This idea that our perceptual experiences are always changing, that they're variable across individuals, that we can't really see what the world is like. Does this person have 3 feet? Does that woman have a foot for a head? Does this guy have no head at all? Is this guy pushing over the Leaning Tower of Pisa? And similarly, has this cat got an incredibly long neck? Is this girl's face actually part of a magazine? Is this girl kissing the Egyptian Sphinx? Has Lenin finally scored a basket on the basketball court? All of these examples are examples of how sensory experience can seem to mislead us about the nature of objects. And this was an important focus of Greek thinking, and particularly Plato wants to address this. He wants to try and understand how it is that we can come to know about the objects of the sensible realm. We can form reasonable judgments about them, even though he wants to also acknowledge that our sensory experiences often aren't as reliable or as informative as we would like them to be. Let's go ahead now and get into the dialogue itself. Starting at the very beginning, I've edited some things out for length in the version of the Theaetetus that you have linked from the syllabus. So I want to sort of briefly summarize what happens to frame the dialogue in these early sections. So Plato begins the dialogue by stating what Socrates and the other discussions was to know. Right? Knowledge. What is knowledge? That is, what is common in Plato's expression to all things, supposedly gender-neutral use of man, are said to know. So what's common to all things that people know? What makes knowledge knowledge? And Socrates then gives his famous midwife speech, wherein he likens himself to a midwife mother trying to help people give birth to their ideas and then to hold them up to the light to see if they are sound. Now, this is a way of framing the role of Socrates in a sort of positive, nurturing light. But the reality of this is much more disturbing. The reality of this is kind of bothersome. It doesn't actually really portray Socrates in a very nurturing light. So midwives during this time helped women give birth. Absolutely true. But part of the midwife's job then was to inspect the new baby to see if the baby was up to snuff, as it were. Is it deformed? Is it defective in any way? And if they were, particularly in places like Sparta, they were often killed. In Sparta, sort of famously, they were supposed to have been thrown off cliffs and crushed on the rocks. So we have this picture of Socrates and what Socrates is supposed to be doing in this dialogue. It's supposed to be portraying him in a favorable light, but from our modern sentiments, it sounds kind of awful. So Socrates is going to help you give birth to your ideas. Then Socrates will hold them up to the light. And if Socrates finds them defective, he will crush them, cast them down against the rocks. So Theaetetus offers up a candidate theory of knowledge. The first theory of knowledge that's offered up is this theory that to perceive something is to know it. So perceiving something is sufficient for having knowledge of it. Now Socrates attributes this theory to Protagoras, who was an itinerant teacher and spent much of his time in Athens. He was also featured in the dialogue, the Protagoras. Socrates suggests the view emerges from the doctrine that all is flux, which he attributes to Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic philosopher who lived in Ephesus around 500 BCE. Now, none of Heraclitus' known writings, and we only have some fragments, clearly and directly articulate the doctrine of universal flux. So this intellectual story that Plato tells, we don't really have any good way of verifying it. But that's not really the point for Plato. For Plato, this view of the sensory realm, of our perceptual experience as constantly in flux, varying, changing, right? That view gives rise to these two alternative positions that he wants to refute. On the one hand, if you look at perception in the way that we did when we were looking at all those visual illusions in those slides earlier, you may well want to say that, look, we can't know anything about the world on the basis of perception. Our perception is constantly fluctuating, changing, contradicting itself. We can't know anything. I'm a skeptic. On the other hand, we might adopt what Plato/Socrates attributes to Protagoras and possibly to Heraclitus, this idea that, well, no, look, because perception is always changing, our ability to judge the nature of our experiences is limited to us in the here and now. That is, to see is to know. You're the only person who could be the arbiter of what it is you see at this moment from this perspective, and epistemic relativism. And Plato doesn't want either of those lines of argumentation to be allowed in the context of the Theaetetus. He wants to disavow both of them, but he doesn't disavow the picture of perception, of sensory experience that gives rise to them. Instead, he wants to argue that this view leads to contradictions. Perceptions can change or contradict one another. He says, look, you see this thing as being really small because you're far away. I see it as being really large because I'm close up. So it's both small and large. It can't be both small and large. Hence, this view leads to contradictory attributions about the very nature of the thing. And we see Plato make these sorts of arguments all throughout his dialogues. He then argues that this view can't even accommodate illusions. So, as with all those illusions that we saw, the world appears in a particular way, but when we investigate it closer, we realize that those objects really don't have those properties. The guy kicking over the Leaning Tower of Pisa really isn't large enough to do that, and so on. And so this view can't accommodate that, because to perceive is to know, and hence, from our perspective, that guy really is that tall. When we get a different perspective, now he's small. Can't accommodate the fact that our perceptions are deceiving. Many other arguments follow in a short space of time here. We recognize that some people know more than others, but on this view, all perception is equal, so the wisest and the foolish of people know to the same extent and degree. Finally, we no longer know something when we cease to perceive it, because to perceive is to know. You're judging your perception. Once you've stopped having that perception, your judgment is no longer valid. All of these things are arguments that he offers up against that initial view, and we'll talk a little bit more about it and his alternatives in the next module.